They say words can build or break destinies. But for one poor boy in a small town, a few cruel words from a teacher would shape the path of his life. A path she'd one day walk through herself, in the most unexpected way. This is the story of Daniel Reyes. The air inside Willow Creek Primary School was dry and heavy. The walls were the color of dust, the ceiling fans barely turning, and the smell of chalk mixed with the faint aroma of old books. Seated in the back row was Daniel Reyes, a 12-year-old boy whose uniform had seen too many wash days and whose shoes were held together by thin strips of tape. His notebook, the one that would soon become a source of humiliation, was a patchwork of reused pages, some torn from old textbooks, others donated by neighbors. But inside that notebook lived dreams. Math equations written in careful handwriting, little sketches of inventions he dreamed of building, and notes from borrowed library books. Across the room stood Mrs. Helen Whitmore, a woman known as much for her elegance as for her sharp tongue. Her clothes were always pressed, her lipstick perfectly applied, her voice sharp enough to cut through steel. To the students, she was a figure of authority. To Daniel, she was a symbol of what he could never afford to be: confident, secure, respected. That morning, Mrs. Whitmore walked between the desks collecting assignments. Her heels clicked with authority. When she reached Daniel's desk, she stopped. "Daniel Reyes, what is this supposed to be?" Daniel hesitated, his hands trembling as he offered his notebook. "Ma'am, I finished the assignment, but I didn't have a new book, so I—" Mrs. Whitmore cutting him. "You didn't have a new book? Oh, how creative. Recycled pages, torn edges, scribbles everywhere. Class, this is a perfect example of what happens when you don't take your education seriously. Look at this notebook. It's a disaster." Laughter filled the room. Harsh, cruel laughter that echoed longer than any lesson that day. Daniel's eyes burned. He wanted to disappear. He had stayed up half the night writing those notes under candlelight, while his mother worked at a local diner to afford his lunch money. But to Mrs. Whitmore, it was just another joke. "If you can't even afford a notebook, Daniel, maybe you should reconsider whether school is the right place for you." The class went silent. Even the children who'd laughed now looked uneasy. Daniel's lips trembled, but he said nothing. He simply closed his notebook, placed it in his worn-out bag, and stared down at the cracked floor tiles until the bell rang. Outside, the sun burned against the dusty streets. Daniel walked home slowly, his shadow long and lonely. At home, his mother, Clara Reyes, was preparing rice and beans, the only meal they could afford that day. "Danny, how was school, mi amor?" He smiled faintly. "It was okay, Mama. Just okay." But inside, something broke. That night, as the wind howled through the cracks of their small apartment, Daniel sat by the candle again, not to study, but to think. He whispered to himself, "Someday, I'll prove her wrong, not by shouting back, not by hating her, but by becoming something she never thought I could be." He didn't know how. He didn't know when. But in that moment, his humiliation turned into fuel. Time passed. Daniel remained one of the brightest students in his class, though always the poorest. Every time Mrs. Whitmore called on him, she made sure to remind the class of his humble background. When Daniel won the regional science fair, she announced, "Congratulations, Daniel. I suppose even broken tools can make something useful once in a while." The word stung, but Daniel said nothing. He had learned that silence was often stronger than anger. When his mother fell ill 2 years later, Daniel dropped out of school to support her. He worked at a hardware store, fixing broken radios and cleaning shelves. Every paycheck, he set aside a small amount for his dream, to one day go back to school. In the years that followed, Daniel taught himself through free library books and borrowed computers at the community center. He learned how to type, how to code, how to think beyond the borders of his town. The mockery of Mrs. Whitmore became a ghost that haunted him and motivated him. Each time he struggled, her words replayed in his head, "Maybe school isn't the right place for you." And each time he'd whisper back, "Maybe it was never the right place for you to teach." Meanwhile, life wasn't as kind to Mrs. Whitmore. Her strict, condescending attitude eventually caught up with her. Parents complained. Students transferred. When funding cuts hit the district, she was among the first to be let go. For the first time in years, she faced something she had never known before: rejection. Her husband left her. Her savings ran out. And the woman who once mocked others for being poor now found herself in the same shoes she had laughed at. Years later, Daniel finally managed to attend a local community college. By day, he fixed electronics. By night, he studied business and computer science. He started a small software service out of his tiny apartment, coding websites for local stores, fixing small tech problems, and building apps for schools. Within 5 years, that little dream grew into Reyes Tech Innovations, a rising company known for creating educational platforms for underprivileged schools. Daniel was now the CEO of his own firm. He had employees, a modern office, and a mission to make learning accessible to every child, no matter how torn their notebook might be. He was everything Mrs. Whitmore once told him he'd never be. But fate was not done writing their story. One rainy afternoon, a job application arrived at Reyes Tech. It was for a training consultant position. The name at the top of the resume? Helen Whitmore. The universe has a way of circling back, sometimes with a smile, sometimes with a lesson. For Daniel, this was more than coincidence. It was the beginning of resolution. The years had not been gentle with Mrs. Helen Whitmore. Her once neat curls were streaked with gray, and the hands that once gripped chalk with authority now trembled as she scrolled through job listings on a second-hand laptop. Her apartment was small, quiet, and cluttered with reminders of a past she could no longer afford to live in. Stacks of old report cards, photographs from school assemblies, certificates that once meant prestige, now just paper memories. She sighed and whispered to herself, "I taught for 20 years, and I'm begging for work like a rookie." Bills piled on the table. Her savings had drained after her divorce, and no school wanted to hire a traditional teacher with outdated methods. Then she saw it, a posting from a tech company called Reyes Tech Innovations, hiring for a training consultant for educational partnerships. Mrs. Whitmore reading aloud, seeking an experienced educator to collaborate with schools and help integrate modern learning tools. She smiled faintly. It sounded perfect, a job that valued experience. She didn't recognize the name Reyes Tech. She just saw a chance for survival. She clicked apply. Reyes Tech Innovations sat in a gleaming glass building downtown. Minimalist decor, clean white walls, and the hum of technology everywhere. Employees in smart casual clothes worked on laptops, brainstorming new ways to bring education to underserved communities. At the top floor, behind a sleek oak desk, sat Daniel Reyes, now in his early 30s, confident, soft-spoken, and respected. He had built the company from scratch. He was the boy who once owned a torn notebook, now creating tools that gave every child a digital one. His assistant, Lena, entered with a tablet. "Mr. Reyes, we've got a new applicant for the training consultant position. She's got decades of teaching experience, though looks like she's been out of work for a while. Let's see." He glanced at the name, then froze. His heart skipped a beat. He read it again, Helen Whitmore. The name was like a ghost resurrected from the dust of memory. A name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Lena, noticing his pause. "Something wrong, sir?" "No, not at all. Just familiar." He smiled slightly, a smile that carried more reflection than amusement. "Schedule her for an interview tomorrow morning. I'll handle it personally." The next day, the office buzzed quietly as the elevator doors opened. Mrs. Whitmore stepped out, clutching a folder to her chest. She wore her best outfit, a faded navy blazer, and the same pearl earrings she'd worn during her teaching days. Her heels clicked on the polished floor, echoing with a hint of the authority she once had. But now, each step was hesitant, careful. "Good morning, ma'am. Please have a seat. Mr. Reyes will see you shortly." She nodded politely and sat down. Her eyes scanned the modern office, the kind of place she'd never imagined working in. Then she saw the name again, etched on the glass door ahead. Daniel Reyes, CEO. Her eyebrows furrowed. The name sounded oddly familiar, but she brushed it off. After all, how many Daniels were there in the world? The door opened. "Lena, Mrs. Whitmore? You can come in now." She stood, smoothed her jacket, and stepped inside. Behind the desk sat a man in a dark suit, reviewing a tablet. He looked up, and their eyes met. A long silence filled the room. "Mrs. Whitmore." "Good morning, Mr. Reyes. Thank you for seeing me." Daniel smiled, his voice calm and professional. "Please have a seat." She sat, unaware of the storm building behind his composed eyes. "I see you have a long background in education. Over 20 years, impressive. What inspired you to apply here?" "Well, teaching has always been my passion. But the world is changing, and I'd like to be part of that change, to help schools adapt to technology." "That's noble. Tell me, in your years as a teacher, how did you motivate struggling students?" Mrs. Whitmore, smiling nervously. "Oh, well, I always believed in discipline. Children need structure, clear expectations. Sometimes a little tough love is necessary." Daniel's eyes flickered. Tough love. He leaned forward slightly. "And what about empathy? Understanding?" "Of course, that too. Though, some students need to learn that life isn't always kind. I tried to prepare them for that reality." There was a pause. "I see. You must have prepared them well." She nodded, relieved by his tone. "I did my best. Even if they didn't appreciate it then, I hope some of them look back and understand I only wanted to help them grow." Daniel looked down at the resume again, at the name, the address, the handwriting in her cover letter. The years melted away. He saw a classroom, a broken notebook, laughter. He took a breath. "Tell me, Mrs. Whitmore, do you remember every student you taught?" "Oh, not all, dear. There were hundreds over the years." "What about one, a boy named Daniel Reyes?" Her smile froze. Her heart skipped. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Daniel Reyes. From Willow Creek Primary. About 20 years ago. He had a notebook you once called a disaster." The silence that followed was unbearable. She stared at him, speechless. Her mind raced back, the classroom, the laughter, the boy in the back row. Her throat went dry. You were that boy?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am. That was me." The color drained from her face. For the first time in years, Helen Whitmore was speechless. "My God, I had no idea. Daniel, you told me to reconsider whether school was the right place for me. Turns out you were half right, it wasn't that school." He leaned back, his tone gentle but firm. "I learned more from what you said that day than from any textbook. It taught me how words can either destroy or inspire." Her eyes filled with tears. "Daniel, I'm so sorry. I was harsh, You were honest, in your own way. But you also taught me something else. That respect means more when you've earned it, not demanded it." The silence stretched. She looked down at her hands, trembling slightly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed a job." "I know. That's why you're here." Daniel stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the city skyline. Life has a way of bringing people full circle, not for revenge, but for reflection. He turned back to her. "You see, Mrs. Whitmore, this company was built to help kids like I once was, the ones who can't afford fancy notebooks or perfect uniforms. We give them a chance to learn without shame." He paused, then added gently, "And sometimes we give second chances to the people who once forgot how much words matter." Her eyes widened. "You mean you're hiring me?" Daniel, smiling faintly. "If you're willing to learn as much as you once taught, yes. But this time, empathy comes first." Tears welled up in her eyes as she nodded. "I don't deserve this kindness." "Maybe not. But someone once told me school isn't for everyone, so I built my own." They both smiled, faintly, not as teacher and student, but as two people who'd learned from the scars of their past. The following week, Mrs. Whitmore walked through the revolving doors of Reyes Tech Innovations as an employee. Gone were the days of chalk dust and wooden desks. Now, she entered a world of sleek screens, youthful faces, and digital learning tools. Every corner of the building hummed with purpose. Teams were discussing school programs, coding updates, and training plans to help low-income schools access better education. And at the heart of it all was Daniel Reyes, not as a distant CEO, but as a humble leader who treated every team member like family. When Mrs. Whitmore entered her new workspace, she was greeted by Lena, Daniel's assistant. Lena, smiling. "Welcome aboard, Mrs. Whitmore. We're excited to have you." She smiled, though her eyes carried a weight of humility. "Thank you. I'm honored to be here." As she settled into her desk, she noticed something pinned on the office wall, a framed photo of Daniel as a child, standing outside an old school, holding a torn notebook. The caption below read, "Every story begins somewhere. Believe in beginnings, even the broken ones." Her eyes filled with tears. She whispered softly to herself, "I broke his beginning, and yet he built a story that helped others start theirs." Over the next few months, Mrs. Whitmore threw herself into her work. She helped design training modules for teachers across underfunded schools, teaching them how to use the educational apps Daniel's company had developed. It was strange at first, being the student again. Technology was not her strength, but Daniel encouraged her patiently. "Take your time, Mrs. Whitmore. We're not chasing perfection here. We're chasing progress." She smiled faintly. "I wish I'd said that to my students more often." Each day, she learned not just about technology, but about humility, collaboration, and compassion. And slowly, the icy wall between her and Daniel melted into mutual respect. One morning, Daniel approached her desk. "We're visiting Willow Creek Primary next week. The same school we both know well. I'd like you to come with me." She froze for a moment. Returning there was like reopening an old wound. But she nodded. "Yes, I think it's time." The school looked smaller than she remembered. The paint was peeling, the desks were still old, and the smell of chalk filled the air. But something had changed. There was laughter, lightness, and hope. Daniel had donated computers, projectors, and digital tablets through Reyes Tech's educational program. The same school that once humiliated him now bore his company's logo on its new learning center. As they walked down the hallway, a young boy rushed past with a tablet in hand. He stopped and greeted Daniel with excitement. "Mr. Reyes, thank you for the computers. Now we can learn online too." Daniel smiled and knelt down. "You're welcome, kiddo. Just promise me one thing. Never stop believing in yourself, no matter what anyone says." The boy nodded and ran off. Mrs. Whitmore watched quietly, tears forming in her eyes. "You changed this place. We changed it. Together." They entered an empty classroom. The walls had fresh paint, but Daniel's eyes found the corner where his old desk used to be. He walked to it, brushed the surface lightly, and smiled. "Right here. This is where I sat." Mrs. Whitmore's voice trembled. "I remember. You were always quiet, always drawing, writing. I never asked why. I just judged what I saw." He turned to her, gently. "You saw a torn notebook, but inside it, I was designing my future." She lowered her gaze, guilt pressing heavy on her heart. "I don't deserve to be here. You do, because you came back. That takes courage." She looked at him, surprised. "We can't change what we said years ago, but we can use it to speak differently now." Later that day, the school organized a small assembly to thank Reyes Tech for their donation. Parents, teachers, and students filled the hall. Mrs. Whitmore sat among them, her hands trembling slightly. Daniel stepped up to the microphone. "Good morning, everyone. I once sat where you are now, right here at Willow Creek." He paused, scanning the room, his eyes warm. "I didn't have much growing up. My notebooks were old, my shoes worn, and sometimes my lunchbox was empty. But I had something powerful, a belief that where I started didn't have to be where I ended." The audience listened, captivated. "And I learned something else, that one person's words can change your life, for better or for worse." He turned slightly toward Mrs. Whitmore, without saying her name. "Years ago, a teacher once told me I didn't belong in school. But she didn't know that her words would become the fire that built this company, and the reason I came back to give others what I didn't have." The crowd applauded. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes filled with tears as she realized. This was forgiveness in its purest form. When the crowd dispersed, Mrs. Whitmore found Daniel outside by the school garden. "You didn't have to say those kind things. I don't deserve any credit. You deserve honesty." and growth. That's what this is about. He smiled kindly. You once told me to reconsider whether school was right for me. You were right, but you forgot something. School isn't a place. It's a journey, and it never really ends. She smiled through tears. You turned my worst moment into your best lesson. That's something only a real teacher could do. Daniel chuckled softly. Then maybe you taught me more than you think. They both laughed, a sound that carried no bitterness, only peace. 5 years passed. Mrs. Whitmore became one of Reyes Tech's most dedicated consultants, traveling to schools across the country, helping teachers modernize their methods and learn compassion through education. Her reputation changed. No longer known for her pride, she was now known for her patience. Daniel's company expanded internationally, reaching millions of students from poor backgrounds, kids who, like him, had dreams trapped inside torn notebooks. One afternoon, while preparing for a conference, Daniel found an envelope on his desk. Inside was a small, old notebook, carefully taped, worn, but familiar. A note was attached. I kept this all these years. The pages may be torn, but they're proof that every broken start can still tell a beautiful story. Thank you for giving me a second chance to learn what teaching truly means, Helen. Daniel smiled softly, closing the notebook with reverence. He looked out the window at the city skyline, whispering, "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting what was said. It's about choosing to speak differently when you finally get the chance." Sometimes life doesn't give us justice. It gives us full circles. The student who was mocked became the teacher. The teacher who judged learned compassion. And in the quiet exchange between the two, we find the truest form of education, not written in notebooks or classrooms, but in forgiveness. Because the most powerful lesson we ever learn is how to let go. Subscribe to Hidden Tale Stories for more stories that inspire the heart and soul. Viewers, let me know your comments about the moral and lesson of this story in the comments section.